Hello, everyone. We're going to go ahead and start back up here. It's my pleasure to welcome Dr. ElZarrad from the Office of Medical Policy, CDER, at the FDA. Dr. ElZarrad is Deputy Director of the Office of Medical Policy at the FDA's Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, where he leads the development, coordination, and implementation of medical policy programs and strategic initiatives. Prior to joining the FDA, he served as Acting Director of the Clinical and Healthcare Research Policy Division with the Office of Science Policy. At the NIH, he's worked on policies related to human subject protections, the design, conduct, and oversight of clinical research, and enhancing quality assurance programs at pharmaceutical development and production facilities. Dr. ElZarrad currently leads multiple projects focused on exploring the potential utility of real-world evidence, innovative clinical trial designs, and the integration of technological advances in pharmaceutical development. Please help me welcome him to the stage.
Hello, everybody. It's a very hard location for this presentation after hearing from Dr. Badi and Dr. Minakoff. But my fear is I'm going to add more questions than answers, and hopefully we'll have a chance to dialogue afterward as well during the conversation, during the presentation, and after as well. So, like I mentioned, I'm the Deputy Director for the Office of Medical Policy, and we're responsible for the implementation of the 21st Century Cure Act when it comes to real-world evidence. I'm going to talk a little bit about that. So for today, we're going to go over high level on the FDA Real-World Evidence program. What do we mean? What's our goals, et cetera. And then I'm going to discuss a little bit the real-world evidence and randomized clinical trials. A lot of you know that randomized clinical trials considered the gold standard, like Jerry mentioned, the treatment clinical trials. I'm going to go beyond that. I'm going to talk about observational data, digital technology, and data capture from other sources as well. And finally, I'm going to discuss with you some of our demonstration projects. So there are a lot of key questions that I'm going to show you that we really need to answer as a community. The FDA is doing our part, and we're funding specific demonstration projects to answer some of those key questions. So, and then in the last third of this conversation, I know this might sound like hyped a little bit, but I want to discuss a little bit of the technology that we're seeing potentially coming our way. For example, artificial intelligence, blockchains, decentralized clinical trials, digital technology, et cetera. I know the presentation after my presentation directly is going to discuss mobile clinical trial with City, so I'm going to leave the bulk of that. But throughout, what I wanted to take out is to realize how technology is becoming the cornerstone for a lot of what we're doing. And then opportunities and challenges throughout. So we're going to see, I think, a lot of helpful tools that's going to help us communicate with our patients, recruiting patients, and understanding how evidence is developed, analyzed, and utilized. So before I start, I want to show you kind of this diagram that came to my attention at a meeting recently in Barcelona, Spain. It's a kind of industry-focused meeting. A statement I want to rephrase to you here that I heard that was really interesting is that if you're a pharmaceutical company and you do not realize yet that you have to be a technology company, you're not paying attention. And you see that the investments in technology is becoming a massive aspect of what you're seeing right now compared even to pharma. But also, if you look at the fastest growing companies in the pharmaceutical fields, a lot of them are technology company or data-based companies, data analytics. So under that kind of general umbrella, we have the requirement as an agency under the 21st Century Cures Act to evaluate the potential use of real-world evidence, to help support approval of a new indication of drugs that are already approved, and also to satisfy post-marketing requirements. So the program is based on a framework that's already available and public, and I think that the comment period was closed just 2 days ago on it, and it's available online. Just to mention briefly the definition of when we say real-world evidence, what do we mean? We mean data regarding the usage or the potential benefits or risk of a drug derived from sources other than traditional clinical trials. This is the language used in the 21st Century Cures Act. But I want to kind of show you a little bit of a slant on that. We think real-world data and real-world evidence can be generated from randomized clinical trials. So when you see our framework, you would realize the definition here that real-world data can be derived from multiple sources, and that's including RCTs. So when you think of real-world evidence, think of real-world data plus analytics to make sense of the data. This is when we have real-world evidence. The evidence itself should be fit for use when you're going to use it for regulatory purposes. I'm going to discuss that a little bit as well. So this is our framework. It's not a long document. It's approximately 30 pages. It's intended for drugs and biological products. It outlines FDA plan to implement the real-world evidence program, but it's multifaceted as well. So when we engage with our sponsors, with our stakeholders in general, they tell us, like, okay, so you're communicating this to us. What are you doing internally? So we kind of clarified here that we have a lot of educational programs internally to prepare our reviewers who see the first applications to this potentially new types of data, new types of evidence that's coming their way. We view this as a commitment to produce multiple guidances, not just one guidance. And stakeholders' engagement is a big part of this. Right now, we devised a very new way to kind of have this interaction with our sponsors. We've been telling them, when you have an idea that utilizes a very novel way of utilizing real-world data, for example, come to us and talk to us at the early stage. This is not a regulatory meeting. We bring our experts, they bring their experts, and we have this high-level exchange of ideas. This way, we can facilitate the development of this program with kind of at the earlier stages before it becomes an actual application. So a little bit about real-world evidence and RCTs, and I think this is kind of, I want to illustrate why we have to think quite a bit when we think about real-world evidence outside of the context of RCTs. Randomizations, a lot of you probably know much better than I do. When you randomize, you're really distributing both known and unknown variables. When it comes to real-world data, we don't know what those known or unknown variables, we don't know the unknown variables in real-world data. And that's a key problem that randomization doesn't solve for us in this setting. So typically data generated from clinical trial as specified for protocol for research purposes, it's high level, pre-specified controls are utilized, random distribution of known and unknown variable, compare that to real world data. A lot of times this data is not produced necessarily for research purposes. A lot of times controls are added depending on the study, and typically there's no random distributions of those variables. So for those reasons, we kind of have to think a little bit about a new paradigm of how to analyze this data, how to make value of them. So we realize this is a big undertaking at the agency. So we have multiple working streams to address these issues. For example, we have a team that's working on the use of EHR, electronic healthcare records and claims data. Another team working on digital health tools, observational data, the use of current healthcare infrastructure to conduct clinical trials. This have some pragmatic element to it. And then data standards and regulatory consideration. The regulatory considerations is very inclusive. It includes the ethical consideration around the utility of real-world data sets as well, and I'm going to mention that a little bit later. So our framework has three main elements to it, and they're illustrated in this figure here. So the first question is the data fit for use? Is the question you're trying to ask can be addressed by the data that's available to you, the real-world data? And then is the study design used to generate the real-world evidence can provide adequate scientific evidence to answer the questions at hand? And then whether the study conduct meet the FDA regulatory requirements. If you realize data standards and implementations is an overarching part of this because we feel that's a major challenge. When you talk about the diversity of data sources, how are you going to standardize that? How are you going to implement such standardization is a challenge that's continuing to be an issue. So just very briefly on what we mean when we say fitness for use. So we coin this term data reliability, which is both accrual and quality control and relevance. So when we think about data, it's not just the data capture, but also how the data is maintained, how is it manipulated. We think all of that, the life cycle of this data, is really important to be able to track and to understand. And data must be suitable to address the specific regulatory questions as we discussed before. The agency itself will not endorse a specific type of real-world data. I mentioned EHR and claims, and we mentioned them a lot because they're available right now to us. But we really think there are multiple other sources of potential useful data. For example, laboratory tests, laboratory results, digital tools can provide, trackers can provide potentially valuable data as well, just to mention a few examples. One of the challenges that we've been seeing over and over again is that sometimes a single source of data doesn't answer the questions, but there is a need to combine and link different sets of data, different sources of data as well. But also that could combine, it could address certain gaps, but also could combine and amplify your bias as well. How do we understand this and how we can move forward with it is an area that we're very interested in. So FDA has been for a while realizing this need to address the digitization of evidence and data. This is just a few examples of guidances we've produced that go all the way from the utility of electronic health record to electronic signatures and beyond, and like how technology can be utilized for the evidence development process in drug development. So also another really promising area is the sources of patient-centric real-world data beyond healthcare records. We think this is a really interesting area, especially as you see more and more entities, organizations start acquiring and capturing data. A colleague of mine at NIH recently told me he heard of a mattress company that started collecting data on how you sleep, because evidently you can control that with your mobile. It keeps data on how well did you sleep with a different type of firmness. This is already data, the company, even their mattress company, but they're also a data company now. So going back a little bit to the challenge of observational studies. So one of the major questions we're asking is, what does transparency look like when it comes to observational data? There is a clear framework of when we think about randomized clinical trials. You have to have pre-registrations. You have to have a clarity of the protocol, pre-specified protocol. You have to have the controls. That's really lined up. But when it comes to observational data, what do we mean when we say we need transparency for observational data? And I think that's a key element here that I'm going to try to expand on a little bit further. And how can technology help us in ensuring that? And also, of course, something of interest to all of us is ensuring the appropriate application of informed consent and other regulation as we move forward with the utility of this data. This is actually, okay, I was told actually not to do this, sorry. Okay, here we go. Okay, this paper actually from the International Society for Pharmacoepidemiology and Observational Research, it's really interesting because it's trying to address what kind of transparency is needed for observational data utility. And I would highly recommend, it's a good read. So again, like for us, it's really important to think about what this transparency means when it comes to real-world data, because we need audit trails. We need to be able, as FDA, to go and verify the data sources and the utility of the data, the manipulation of the data. We need to see all of that. And identifying and preventing data cherry picking. This is a major concern because when you do randomized clinical trials, it's an extremely expensive thing. So you really have to be very careful with every step. You have to employ multiple controls. When it comes to having a large data set and you start analyzing, you can run 10,000 simulations until you get the answer that you want. So how do we deal with that from an FDA perspective? I think this is a really important issue. Should we require sensitivity analysis, for example, and statistical diagnostic to provide us a little bit more confidence in how this data is going to be used for causal inference? And of course, there are tons of other considerations here. So one way we tackle that is by producing or funding demonstration projects. I put them in 3 different buckets, kind of a high level, but we thought about it as, we need to focus on the data, on the tools utilized and methodologies utilized for the analysis of the data, and then the study design themselves. I'm just going to mention a few examples of each. We have a lot more demonstration projects than actually we're going to show here. So focusing first on the data, we think data relevancy, quality, linkages, security are all really important for us to understand. To give you just one quick example of that, so EHRs, they have a lot of promise because they include a very, potentially granular picture of how the patient health is. They include labs, include imaging, include pathology reports. However, data in pathology and radiology and clinical notes are often unstructured. That's 80% of the times. And typing in EHR doesn't necessarily lead to consistency and complete documentations. I heard recently there are 1,000 different ways to describe A1C in EHRs. Just think about that, this single thing. And then clinical outcome measures for drug approvals may not be used for consistently recorded in practice. So you might want to capture one endpoint that's not going to be captured in EHR, and that endpoint is going to be the key. So how can we work on what endpoints are suitable to be captured in EHR or in a clinical setting in general? One of our demonstration projects is a collaboration with Dr. Laura Eisman from UCSF, and the idea is to try to digitize different data sources and collect them in a quality way, regardless if they're originated from a clinical practice or research, and to be able to utilize this capture for multiple purposes in the end, including research, evidence generations, or even clinical care. They call it capture it one time, capture it in a good quality, and then you can utilize the data for multiple purposes. We think that's a really promising approach, and I think it's a very ambitious, actually, project, and I think if we can scale it up and understand it better, that would be very helpful. Another example regarding RWD Real-World Evidence tools, we think a lot about common data models, how to standardize. digital technology tools, advanced analytical techniques. And just one example that we developed in-house, we had a team that developed this called My Studies app. It's available already online. And the idea behind it is to provide a secure environment for data capture and data transfer from clinic, from physicians to the FDA potentially. So providing that platform in an easy mobile format, we thought it would be a really good idea. The code for this is available for free on GitHub, and anybody can use it. It's already been utilized actually in a couple of our demonstration projects, and there is an FDA seminar on it, Small Business Innovation Assistance Seminar, that's coming in May. If you Google just FDA SBIA, you'll find the listing for that. That explains the potential utility. Then another project that's really interesting, which involved the evaluation of deep learning techniques for disease monitoring using wearable and sensors for exploring novel patient-centered outcomes among patients specifically with heart failure. This is a collaboration with Yale Mayo, and it explored the utility of 2 digital mobile health platforms. And the idea is start capturing data and see how this data, this is multiple data forms, including the ECG, heart rate, respiratory rate, accelerometer, steps, activity, and sleep. And how can those data potentially be helpful to start structuring a potential outcome that we can utilize for those patients from a regulatory perspective. All our demonstration projects aim to publish publicly and provide kind of a clear analysis of what the value of the demonstration project is. This one, we're hoping within 15 months from the establishment, which is mean by the end of 2019, we'll have some data from that. And then finally, real-world evidence study design. And again, like I said, randomized clinical trials can benefit a lot from real-world evidence. When I was at NIH, one of the major reasons for failure, for premature termination of clinical trials, is lack of accrual. And it's really sad to see like a whole clinical trial with a good hypothesis, and then like in the end you collapse because you couldn't accrue enough patients, you know. And the question was, like, where's the problems here? Where are the problems? And one of the problems is the lack of targeting certain sites that provide you with the number of patients you have. A lack of available data sets that would tell you as a sponsor where you should go to recruit those patients, you know, what site you should target. Real-world data can provide us with that. So I feel like there is a really understated promise here for the utility of these data sets to improve randomized clinical trials. And then assessment of observational studies is a really key issue because we've been hearing and we're trying to collaborate on methodological techniques, statistical methodological techniques on how to verify observational data sets. Propensity matching is one of them, for example. But one other project that addresses some of these elements is done within the FDA Catalyst program. FDA Catalyst is a collection, is a data set of claims data within the FDA. And this actually study done within the registry, within this FDA Catalyst registry. To my understanding, is the first randomized clinical trial that's done within a registry that utilize an educational intervention. So the idea is you identify patients with atrial fibrillation, and then you send them you mail them information on if they should take to their physician about the use of novel anticoagulants, because that will lower their chances of stroke. And using that approach, we're trying to see how registries can be utilized to really intervene among the public in general. So it's a very interesting trial. And we have an estimated timeline for that, some data coming in 2019, and then in 2020, which we have hopefully a fuller results. Another one that I'm really excited about is that attempted replication of phase 3 and phase 4 randomized clinical trials. Those are clinical trials that FDA already used to make a regulatory determination. And we're trying to ask the questions, are the observational data sets available out there? Can they replicate those studies? Are they good enough to replicate those studies? And if we try, will they give us the same results? I like this project because if it's failed or succeeded, it's going to give us some key elements of information here. It's going to tell us how observational data can be utilized. They're scaling up. They started with a few trials, and they're scaling up now to 40 trials, and hopefully we'll have some of those complete by 2020, actually. So moving into a little bit of the hype, I know like when I heard first of all about artificial intelligence, I thought like, oh, how far that is from us. And that was a big mistake. And you know, now thankfully we're engaged with multiple stakeholders on artificial intelligence for health. We are already co-chairing a committee with the International Telecommunication Union, ITU, and the WHO, focused on understanding the artificial intelligence uses for health. But also, the big surprise for me is that the Center for Devices are already seeing algorithms in devices, and they're already having to evaluate algorithms in devices. So that was kind of, I was within the agency when I heard about this, and I was kind of like, wow, this is really amazing. And if you want a full list, there is a paper by Eric Tobol, and this paper lists I think 9 of them so far, 9 devices that are already cleared by the FDA with AI algorithms in them. Now, the challenge of AI is not going to stop here, because if you look at the latest, this is actually the slide I added just a few days ago, because we had just released, the Center for Devices released this proposed framework for the modification of AI and ML, machine learning. And if you look at this, a lot of the devices we cleared so far, they're based on algorithms that are stable. They're fixed. The time they're coming in, they get fixed, and we understand what the potential outcomes of those algorithms. You have data input, you know the data outcomes. But what happens when those algorithms are adaptable? The whole idea behind machine learning is you improve over time. You get more data, you have hopefully better sets of data out. And that's not necessarily always the case. I'm going to discuss that a little bit. But we don't have yet a framework or an understanding as a community of how we're going to deal with those approaches, those systems in general. And the way I see it is like we're not just responsible for making sure that these tools are safe, but also we want to make sure that when a tool is extremely promising to patients' health, that it moves forward too. So like you have that kind of always balance that's really hard when it comes to those tools. So for us, AI is really interesting because we need to understand the complexity. This is actually another New York Times article on AI, and it's actually about Halloween costumes. And it's one of the best AI articles I've ever read because it discusses how biases can be originated within AI systems and within the data sets. It gives actual examples of when AI went awry and how disastrous that is. So, I'm not going to go over it in detail, but if you read it, it's really, really interesting. Like, for example, it was asked to sort letters to certain numbers and in a specific order with minimizing errors and decided, I'm going to delete the whole list because that's the best way to ensure there's no errors. So we have a long way to go. AI prediction algorithms predict the most likely decisions or answer that might be achieved using the input data, not necessarily the accurate answer, though. AI predictions and solutions could reflect flaws in algorithm and data sets and provide unpredictable solutions, and how to prepare for that from a health perspective is going to be a really key thing for us. So this is a very busy slide, so I'm not going to go over every detail in it, but I want you to have it because this is a lot of what we're thinking about. What is needed at this point? We need to understand the functions, the tasks that lend themselves to AI adoption and those that we're not ready for that yet. We don't want to risk patients' health, human health, with areas that we're not sure about. But then a convergence of multidisciplinary expertise to address the evolution of AI is really critical. This is a very scary thing we've been seeing. You have now more and more computer scientists, informatics type scientists dealing with these data sets, but they lack the understanding of how clinical practice work. And I think bridging this gap is going to be really critical. Having teams that understand the clinic and understand the informatics together is going to be a really critical aspect for how this field is going to move. Of course, we need educational and training programs. It's already one of the major areas we're going to have a skill shortage, and this is, I think, is going to impact all of us. And of course, the ethical implication of all of this is a key. And we know that the AI systems can be limited by multiple things, not just the algorithms, but also the data sets. We need pilots to explore those systems, and we need to understand that failure is an integral part of machine learning and training because the whole algorithm learns from failure. It improves with failure. So a failure doesn't mean failure in the standard term that we have right now. A failure for machine learning is going to be a better outcome in the end. So like how are we going to calculate that, compute that within our evidence generation paradigms? And then shared understanding of principles, of course, this is going to be a critical issue. So let me see. Okay, so moving on, just have a couple of slides on blockchain because we have right now a program that looks into pilots for blockchain and the utility for blockchain. Without kind of getting into too much details on the definition of blockchain, but the whole idea is that any transactions, when you have a blockchain system, any transactions will be tracked precisely, any modification will be tracked, and the whole system is linked with each other. So the chances of manipulations is minimal, and any manipulation will be tracked. The idea is actually to make any kind of chances of manipulation being hidden almost impossible. So it's very interesting from a perspective of, how can you track drug supply chain all the way from the beginning, the manufacturing, to the distribution. So if you utilize a system like a blockchain, the principles behind blockchain, I don't want to be stuck to the technology itself, but the principles behind blockchain can provide us with that visibility throughout the continuum of a drug life cycle. I think this is a very promising thing in the future, and we have a pilot on it. You'll see multiple articles on that right now if you just Google the topic. But the other interesting thing about blockchain, the questions of using them for transparency, especially when it comes for informed consent, is another really interesting aspect. It was described to me as if you have a blockchain system for informed consent, potentially will empower the patients to control their data and who access their data, and they will have visibility. Nobody can access their data without them knowing, practically. So I'm not the technology guy, but that's, I think, the concept, the principles is really interesting here, at least to explore. One other initiative that we've been working on that addresses AI and addresses actually blockchain and beyond large data sets is the Informed initiative, which is we're trying to bring even postdoctoral fellows and do pilots and do specific works that explore those technology sets, if you would, and how we're going to move forward when it comes to all these innovations together. So this is one small approach that's led by actually Dr. Sean Cousin, and he's available on Twitter. He's very proliferative tweeter. And then he actually really discusses a lot of these innovations and provide the articles behind them. He's leading this initiative at this point. When it comes to decentralized clinical trial, I know I'm shifting now into more like the design. I'm not going to talk much here because I know the talk following mine is focused on this area, but I think this is really promising. I had some of my education, I heard the lady from Mississippi before, but I had some of my education in Alabama as well. And I can understand and value really if you can have a way for patients in rural area to participate in research as well. I've always seen innovations, at the time I was at NIH, that's really great innovations, but typically they're implemented in large clinical centers. And I feel like, what are we leaving behind? Those who cannot access those clinical trials. Can we do better in that area? And I feel like this is a really promising way, not for everything, but for certain types of clinical trials to be done, within the homes, within the clinics themselves. And this is just a remarks by our previous commissioner here that highlighted the importance of this area. But what I want to go to is like what's new, because we've been using certain aspects, before. We've used decentralized data collection for years. We've used outpatient trials. We rely on patient reports and local providers to deal with serious adverse event. That's been done. Using interactive voice reply systems, telephone follow-up, patients' diaries, that's been utilized. So what are areas that are actually new and promising? There are a lot of new technologies, for communication, for data capture and transmissions. All of you hold in your hand, like a very kind of strong computer right now in your phone. So it's kind of shame not to be able to utilize that for the benefit of patients and for communication with the patients. I think that's a great tool. We have cameras now on phones on average that much better than any human eye, So think about that when you're capturing pictures potentially of, like skin disorders, And then recognitions of the value of local health providers in performing trial-related functions. Typically when somebody gets sick, they think of their physicians. They're not going to think necessarily of who the trials physician is. So I think incorporating potentially a lot of this kind of trials within the healthcare settings that's available to the patients will be very fascinating and interesting thing. So to facilitate this kind of interaction, and again, this is a very busy slide, but this is another app that we developed within the agency, and the idea behind it is to allow for the transfer of data and analysis this time within the cloud. So the data will be uploaded, analyzed, and transmitted to the FDA. And this is the flow of this. And I'm showing you these apps because I want you to see how clearly the cloud is going to be a big part of how we're going to move forward. Fast data transfer, fast data analysis is going to be an issue. But then how to transfer this data in an accurate way, in a secure way, all those are parameters. But this is the future. I have a colleague of mine told me yesterday, so how is all of this going to work for clinical trials? Are we seeing it in clinical trials? Because of most of what we're seeing right now is really within the device world. It's coming, and actually, if you look, you will see companies already working on that. AICure and IBM are two examples of this. AICure have a software-based app that actually utilizes your phone or your tablet to identify your face. There's no human on the other side. This is all software-based. It identifies your face, so to identify that you're the right patients who are enrolled. It identifies your pill you're taking. It knows this is the type X pill, and identify that you swallowed the pill. It sends all this data automatically to a centralized site. So, this is stuff that's coming our way potentially. So there are a lot of advantages, so I'm not going to spend time here, but also there's a lot of considerations for us. Here's a list of what we think could be advantages, but also we have to worry about stuff like transparency, tracking, audit trail, and how we can verify this data capture and data transfer and then make sense of them in an analytical side of things. So, the digital tech and novel trial designs are really critical issue as we move forward collectively, and I would encourage you to see them as a continuum, not as a separate issues. They provide us with a bigger opportunity to participate in clinical trials, as I mentioned before, but applying the current standards and regulation to new paradigm might have its own challenges. A lot of the considerations are not unique to decentralized clinical trials, so I think a lot of what we have already framework-wise can be applied there, but also we have to think about the differences. We have to have considerations such as what disease areas, investigational drugs, or the type of functions can be centralized, we can utilize digital health on them, on which one we're not ready for that yet. So all in all, it's a major player, I believe. So I put this next diagram here because, in a way, this is the future, and it's going to have a lot of promise, but also a lot of challenges to us. So we have all this data generated now about patients, even like in a passive way. Even when you're sitting, your phone is collecting data. So how can all this data be, in a good way, in a way that's aligned with the regulations, with the standards, be utilized to improve patients' health? I think that's really a critical issue that we all have to think about. I had a supervisor a long time ago at the National Cancer Institute he told me if there is a commandment for health research, it should be that no good data should go to waste. And and he highlighted the good, no good data should go to waste. So, and I think this is hopefully the future that we have to have. So in conclusion, FDA is committed to exploring the potential use of real-world evidence to fully incorporate useful evidence in the regulatory paradigm, and to maximize the use of real-world data and real-world evidence would require us to have multiple skills and multiple resources. We have to work together practically. Multiple stakeholders' efforts and collaborations are necessary to address this diversity of scientific, technical, regulatory, and ethical issues and challenges. FDA pilots projects, we're hoping to answer some parts of the questions that are important there and fill the knowledge gap in those areas. And then technology is really the cornerstone that will enable the optimization of data collection, analysis, and evidence generation. And I want to highlight that from the concept of also the skill sets that we may need to acquire in our fields. When you think of an IRB, do you have somebody who's going to understand informatics? Do you have somebody who understands data analytics and the risk around that, for example? I'm not the expert in IRB, so I'm throwing that at you guys. Finally, I just want to acknowledge there are a lot of people in my office who are working in this. This is a few examples. My boss, Jacqueline Kurgan-Cry, David Martin, who's actually working on the real-world evidence primarily. He leads those projects. Leonard Sachs, who's our digital tools guru. Diane Barrowan, who actually keeps the whole project online, and along with Kayla Holman. And we have the FDA Real-World Evidence Subcommittee, which is a committee that actually focuses on interaction with sponsor. At a high level, we allow for this interaction because sponsors typically see the FDA as a barrier sometimes. And we're trying to say, no, come to us, bring your information. We're happy to have this high-level dialogue. So the committee has actually been the tool for this. And I will stop here and open it for questions. Thank you.